Education Research Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you all in this morning in the name of the Network's Convener Group. This is the final webinar of our series of 5 lectures over the spring of 2024, which we organized to prepare and warm up to the theme of the annual conference. This year at the Easter conference, the Sociologists of Education Network will focus on the social imaginaries of the future, the making and unmaking of certainty in education. There is one important housekeeping rule I should announce at the beginning. We will record the talk and the discussion and publish it on the website. I will now give the floor to my co-convenor, Matthias de Kuyper, who will chair the session and introduce today's keynote. Matthias?
Okay, thank you very much, Esther, and good morning to all of you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Rachel Brooks, who is a living legend in the field of sociology of education and sociology more broadly. So it's really a pleasure to have you here, Rachel. And for those of you who are not familiar with her work, probably that's not a lot of people, since Rachel has published and worked on so many different things and themes that connect us in this network and that bind us together in this network. A couple of examples are her continued work on the role of higher education and how students are acted upon, how they are forced or allowed to be mobile in Europeanization context, the role of space in that role of spatiality, the role of the family, caretaking, and all these kind of things are things that Rachel has devoted her entire career on, and in a super very interesting way. She's equally, and you might know her from her role as editor of the journal Sociology, as executive editor of the journal, the British one, the British Journal of Sociology of Education, as well as her role as book series editor of research into higher education research. So Rachel is all over the place with a lot of different things. And what is super interesting for us today, and equally in view of the network goal, which focuses on imaginaries of the future and the role of time, and the fact that we as a network have last year in Glasgow equally discussed that the role of time seems to be something that once in a while gets to be a bit neglected in the field of sociology of education. So it's our great pleasure that Rachel agreed to deliver a keynote on that. She will do that for 30 to approximately 45 minutes, and then we have 45 to approximately 30 minutes left for discussion, for questions. I will guide that question and answer session. I think you're most welcome to put questions in the chat already. But given the fact that it is always nicer to just talk, you can equally just raise your hand and I will give you the floor. Before doing so, however, Rachel, the floor is yours, and we are very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias, and thank you to you and Esther for the invitation to talk. Okay, so I should just share my screen and hopefully this will work okay.
We can see your notes now.
Is that okay?
No, it's good. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, super. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. As you can see, my presentation is called Higher Education Timescapes, Temporal Understandings of Students and Learning. I'm just going to minimize the... right, okay. So just a little bit of background to start with, to indicate the kind of literature that I'm situating my talk in. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, education has long been associated with analyses of social time. That means the recognition that time is multiple and heterogeneous and varies both within and across societies. And this could be dated back to E.P. Thompson's seminal essay in 1967, which argued that schools were a central means of inculcating what he called time thrift among the population in the 18th century, and so reinforced the clock time brought about by the Industrial Revolution in the UK. And extending this kind of analysis a bit further, Barbara Adam wrote in 1995 that the requirement in Western-style societies to produce good work fast at the correct rate to deadlines determined by timetable and calendars is underpinned by quantitative time. It is this dominant time, so central to our adult social life, which gets habituated during childhood through the time discipline promoted in education. Time has to be used effectively and budgeted with care. Now, recent research has extended this kind of analysis from school to other parts of the education system, including higher education, which is my focus today. And a key focus of this body of work has been the increasingly sort of fast-paced nature of university life. Education has been accelerated, it's commonly held, because of wider social change that's quickened the pace of life, often linked to the influence of what Castells has called time-space compression, and associated social imperatives to become more efficient and compete with others in neoliberal societies. And I think with respect to higher education in particular, scholars have noticed the increased pace with which academic staff are expected to work, as well as the disparagement of timeframes of longer duration that are often required for book writing and other research-related pursuits. There's also now a relatively large body of work that's argued, which has emphasised the ways in which hegemonic university time may fail to recognise the alternative temporalities of some groups of students, particularly those from non-traditional backgrounds. But while this body of work provides a useful insight into the temporalities of the contemporary university, I would suggest that they've typically confined themselves to looking at one particular nation state or even one particular institution within a single nation. So as a result, I think we know relatively little about how student timescapes differ between nations. And I think this is relevant to claims in the wider literature that across Europe in particular, student life has become increasingly similar through policies such as the Bologna Process and the European higher education area. And the kind of, I suppose, way in which many European nation states have adopted neoliberal norms in their higher education sector. And so in this paper, I'm going to explore how student temporalities are played out or have been played out across 6 European nations. And I suppose as part of that discussion, I'll consider whether the kind of European educational reforms I've just mentioned, the Bologna Process, European higher education area, have helped to forge common European timescapes, or whether we still see differentiation in this area. The concept of timescapes I'm taking from Barbara Adams' work, and she has emphasised how we shouldn't look at time just as a phenomenon in itself, and how it's commonly linked to space, context, and matter. And so in looking at these different geographical and national contexts, I'm going to be thinking about the relationship between time and those kind of things that Adam has flagged up. In terms of the methods, the data that I'm going to be drawing on, it comes from a 6-year European Research Council funded project that I finished a couple of years ago, but we've only just finished writing up really. The broader project looked at how students were conceptualized across Europe, looking at both similarities and differences within individual nation states, but also across them. The 6 countries in our study were Denmark, England, Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Spain. And they were chosen so that there was quite significant diversity in terms of their relationship to the European Union. England left through Brexit just as the study was starting, but also in terms of welfare regime, the way higher education is funded, and the nature of any financial support that's given to students. And the next table, I'm not expecting you to kind of read all of that, but that I suppose gives you a flavour of those different variables and how they vary across the 6 countries in the study. And I suppose particularly relevant for this presentation are perhaps the kind of financial ones at the end, because I'm going to argue that they have some considerable bearing on student timescapes. So In the wider project, there were 4 strands. We looked at conceptualizations of students within policy, looking at policy documents, interviewing policymakers. In the media, we looked at films and TV shows that figured students prominently, but also newspaper articles. And then we looked at higher education institutions, particularly how students were represented on university websites, but also through interviews with staff and then students themselves. And in each country in the study, we collected data at 3 different higher education institutions chosen to represent something of the diversity of the higher education sector in that country. This paper in particular doesn't draw on all of that data. It does draw on some of the policy analysis, and it does draw on the interviews with policy actors and higher education staff, but probably it's the student data that I'll be focusing primarily on. And here we conducted 54 focus groups with 295 undergraduate students across those 6 countries. And I should say that the way in which we tended to operate pretty much all of the interviews and focus groups is we started with a very kind of broad question about, in general, how do you understand students? And then over the course of the interview and the focus group, we narrowed down so that towards the end, we asked them about specific representation. So for example, do you consider students as political actors or consumers? One of the things that we did in the focus groups, which you'll see in the slides that I'm going to present, is that at the start, we asked all the students to make 2 plasticine models, one that represented how they saw themselves as a student, and one which represented how they felt others saw them as a student. And so I'll illustrate some of my points with some of those models as we go through. The other thing to mention is that we didn't specifically ask them about time at all. It wasn't something that was in any of the interview schedules, and it wasn't something that we'd really thought about before we started the data collection, but it did emerge as a really important theme in many of the focus groups. And so the analysis when we were looking at time was a kind of an inductive one, looking at what students said about this. Okay, so that's a little bit about the methods and the background. To go on now to the kind of what I want to argue in this paper. And I suppose what I want to argue is that when we looked at the data and all the things that students said about time in this quite sort of unprompted manner, there did seem to be important differences by nation state in the ways in which students and their relationship to time were understood. And I want to suggest that there are 3 main timescapes that we can identify that relate to different national contexts. First, and I'm going to go through all of these in much more detail, but just to kind of list them at the start. First of all, what I've called flexible and loosely bounded student timescapes under threat, which was talked about quite a lot in Denmark and Germany. Secondly, what I've called limited and tightly bounded student timescapes in England, Ireland, and Spain. And then thirdly, what I've called limited and loosely bounded student timescapes in Poland. So I'm now just going to go through those 3, explain what I mean by them, and then after I've done that, offer some explanations of why we see these differences across Europe. So first of all, the flexible and loosely bounded student timescapes under threat from Denmark and Germany. And I should say the photos on the right-hand side are meant to be an hourglass at the top and then a clock in the second one. And in Denmark and Germany, this was a really common way in which students made a model to represent how they felt. Either they felt themselves or how they felt they were seen by others. So in Denmark and Germany, time was a really kind of key theme in the focus groups that was brought up a lot by many, many students and was kind of illustrated in many of their plasticine models. And in large part, I would say that student responses were closely linked to reforms that had been implemented in both countries in the recent past and which had courted considerable controversy within the higher education sector. So in both nations, as you might well know, politicians have explicitly attempted to quicken the pace of study and reduce the average length of a bachelor's programme through tying degree completion to a specific period of time. By tying degree completion within a specific period of time to both student grants and university funding, and altering qualification structures. And this has often been linked to the Bologna Process, which has sought to increase the comparability of degree programmes across Europe. But I would say that in both countries, it's also been informed by national priorities, including concerns about slow completion, which predated the Bologna Process. And the associated cost of higher education to taxpayers. So time was also mentioned not only by students, but by higher education staff and policy influences in both these countries, and was also quite an important focus of many of the policy documents that we analysed too, particularly those from Denmark. So, like some of their counterparts in the other European countries that I'll mention a bit later, Danish and German students typically saw university time as distinctive and different from that they'd experienced at school. However, while students from the other nations believed that this distinctiveness lay in the freedom that they had when compared to school to decide how they spent their time on a day-to-day basis, for Danish and German students, it was bound more closely to discretion over the pace at which they moved through their studies and the duration of their degree. They also held, however, that this distinction was being eroded because of the reforms to encourage students to progress more quickly and complete their degrees within a shorter period of time. And students from these two countries argued that whereas in the past they'd had considerable flexibility and autonomy about how they spent their time, this had now been lost as a result of the need to progress more quickly through their studies and complete a particular number of credits each academic year. And these imperatives, they felt, had a direct and negative impact on their learning. And so there's just a quotation there from a German focus group where the students said, "The consensus is that you should finish your degree as quickly as possible and then enter the labour market as quickly as possible. It's no longer about assimilating a wide range of knowledge by adding several semesters that you don't need, but that would help you grow as a person and broaden your knowledge. It's just important to get through as fast as possible." And very similar comments were made by Danish students too. A similar loss was articulated in relation to the perceived impact of the reforms on the day-to-day allocation of time. Spending time on volunteering, engaging in paid work, and travelling abroad were all considered by focus group participants as potentially important aspects of the broader experience of being a higher education student, which enhanced formal learning. However, they believe that these have become much harder to pursue because of the requirement to move through their studies much more quickly. And so again, I've put a quotation on the slide there from a Danish focus group where the student said, if you get a good job during your degree and make good connections there, that will increase the speed that you get a job afterwards. And with this, meaning after the reforms, there are no opportunities to take the time to have a year or 3 months to focus on a job. So here, employment during a degree, seeing as an important part of the process of learning. And so here, I think we see the boundaries of what it means to be a student defined quite widely, and certainly not tied only to formal learning. And the positioning of paid work in particular as enhancing rather than detracting from learning is of note, I think, given the concern that's often raised in Anglophone nations about the negative consequences of combining both. And I'll come back to that in a minute. This perspective, I think, wasn't, however, shared by various other stakeholders in Denmark and Germany, who didn't view time spent on such extracurricular pursuits as a necessary part of what it means to be a student. And so, for example, this was expressed quite clearly by the representative of Danish Employers Organisation, who told us that far too much stuff is taking up their time. And I think more generally, policymakers in Germany and Denmark typically constructed students implicitly and sometimes explicitly too as slow and taking too much time over their studies. So, for example, students were in the policy documents commended for having improved the pace of their learning, implying that their past behaviour had been problematic. And so in these two countries, students saw these kind of historical timescapes as under threat, and they were certainly highly contested, with students and on one hand and staff and policy actors on the other having different views. So that's the first timescape I want to talk about. The second is what we saw in England, Ireland and Spain, which I've called limited and tightly bounded student timescapes. So while time was a key point of contention in how students and their lives should be understood in Denmark and Germany, it was discussed in much more consensual terms in England, Ireland and Spain. And here, understandings were typically shared by all or most of the social actors that we spoke to. Student perspectives were on the whole echoed by higher education staff and policy influencers. Moreover, much tighter temporal boundaries were drawn around students and student life. Many focus group participants in these three nations remarked on what they believed to be the distinctiveness of university time when compared to school time. The former, university time, was typically characterised as much freer, largely because of the open-ended nature of some learning tasks and the often quite substantial reduction in the number of contact hours compared to school, requiring better self-discipline and strong time management skills. And so this quotation that I put on the slide from an Irish student is quite typical. So they said, "I think university has really reframed the way that I think about my day and how I spend my time. I was very by the book in secondary school, primary school, and there was your expectation of what would happen in a day would be what it is. At university, you can embrace the less structured way of experiencing the day." For some students, this was also quite substantially different from how they expected to experience time in the future. And I think it's quite significant that this specialness of university time was not thought to be compromised by the requirement in these three countries to complete a degree within a specific and relatively short period of time, usually 3 or 4 years for a bachelor's degree. And so while their peers in Denmark and Germany also emphasised the distinctiveness of university time, as I've been talking about previously, this was held by students, if not other social actors, to be severely compromised by the reforms to incentivise degree completion within a specific time frame. So here we see this quite big difference between England and Ireland, Spain on one hand, and Denmark and Germany on the other. A further difference between the two groups of countries can be seen in students and others' views of the position of paid work, and relatedly, the time that should ideally be devoted to formal education. So, as I've said, the students who participated in our German and Danish focus groups had a strong view that part of the distinctiveness of university time was related to the opportunities it offered to engage in quite a wide range of activities and follow one's own interests, not just pursue formal learning. And so, as I've said, university education was believed to be enhanced by things like becoming involved in volunteering, overseas exchanges, and paid work. In contrast, however, students in England, Ireland, and Spain tended to draw much tighter boundaries around learning time and typically thought that time spent in paid work should only be considered as part of their education if it related directly to their studies or desired future career. Many students spoke of having little choice but to work in order to be able to afford their higher education, but often believed that this had a negative impact on their university studies. And this was a view that was commonly shared by members of staff that we interviewed. So, for example, one interviewee at an English university that we interviewed said that she'd like to see students reading more widely, but thought that this was no longer possible for many students because of the competing demands on their time. And so I put the quotation from her on the slide. She said, "I mean, if you have to do paid work to supplement your income, if you're looking ahead for future careers, getting internships or work experience, I don't think you can get away with just doing that. By that she meant just devoting your time to studying. And a lot of our students, even if they're from a privileged background, are working all summer to get money to come back for term. So here, this kind of, you know, sense that paid work was something that was actually detracting from education, not adding to it. And so, although here she refers to such pressures applying to all students, our student data would suggest that it was those from low-income families who experienced these kind of pressures particularly acutely. So, for example, a Spanish member of staff described how term-time jobs could affect the subject choices available to students, as well as their academic performance more generally, commenting that it's very difficult to do engineering or medicine and paid work at the same time. So you have to have the family resources to be a full-time student. So in Spain, in contrast to participants in Denmark and Germany, and in line with those in England and Ireland, employment during the course of a degree was rarely seen as a positive and integral part of what it means to be a student. And in these three countries, there was little evidence of the contestation of timescapes that I talked about previously in relation to Denmark and Germany. No student raised any concern about either the length of their degree programme or the pace that they were being asked to progress at. So that takes us to the third timescape that I wanted to talk about. And that's the one that was evident in Poland, and that I've called a limited and loosely bounded timescape. So in Poland, as in the other 5 nations in the study, students indicated that they considered university time distinctive. And this was explained in different ways, although comments typically related to the allocation of time on a day-to-day basis, as in England, Ireland, and Spain, rather than the overall duration and pace of a degree, as was evident in Denmark and Germany. So students spoke, for example, about time flying by when one was studying alone with often nothing tangible to show for it, and about the new freedom university offered to decide how time was spent. And several talked about how they had learnt to become more responsible in the way they allocated their time over the course of their degree, with relatively less time spent partying. So I've put some quotations up on the slide there. So this was from one of the Polish focus groups, where one participant said, "At first there was the syndrome of loosening the leash. Without our parents' control, we do what we want. But now I'm a bit bored by that." And the second participant said, "Yes, it was similar for me. The first year was about letting off steam, but after my first year, I started to work in my free time. And in the second year, I started to work regularly. And now there's even more responsibility." So like their counterparts in England, Ireland, and Spain, no Polish student problematized the pace at which they were expected to move through their degree programme or the overall length of their degree. However, they differed from the English, Irish, and Spanish students with respect to the boundaries they drew around their studies. In particular, engagement in paid work was seen as an important part of being a student and not something that compromised one's ability to learn well. So unlike in England, Ireland, and Spain, boundaries were not drawn tightly around understandings of the student. Work was considered an important part of the experience of being a student to help prepare an individual for the labour market on graduation, as well as providing useful financial support in the present, rather than something that detracted from their ability to concentrate fully on their degree programme. And I think here, in valuing employment highly and considering it as an intrinsic part of being a student, we see parallels with Denmark and Germany. However, unlike those countries, Polish students didn't see that their preferred time allocation as under threat, or was in tension with the kind of timescapes advocated by policymakers. So, for example, in the quotation on the slide, a key aspect of being a responsible student is choosing to spend one's time in paid work rather than on partying. And indeed, I think what we found here does link to what some other studies have indicated about the centrality of paid work to Polish student identities. So, for example, the Euro student study that conducts surveys of students across different European countries, when that has asked students who have engaged in paid work during their studies whether they identify primarily as a student or primarily as a worker, it's very interesting that the percentage identifying as a worker is really much higher in Poland than in many other countries. So, for example, in that study, over 48% of Polish students said that their primary identity was as a worker, compared with only 25% in Ireland and 9% in Denmark. And I think when we've been thinking about these kind of issues, we've explained this kind of phenomenon in Poland in relation to the very fast expansion of higher education that the country saw after the fall of communism. And what seems to be a common perception in the country, that as a result of this very fast expansion, a degree has lost much of its labour market value. And so there is then pressure on students to engage in paid work during their studies to show the kind of the added value that they offer. Okay, so that brings me to the end of going through the three different timescapes that we identified in the project. I want to now kind of move on to sort of looking kind of comparatively across them and offering some kind of explanations for what we see. So I think, first of all, it's worth thinking about kind of what's making up these student timescapes, what are the constituents of them? And I think, to me, there seem to be three clear elements. First, a clear distinction was made by many of the students in our sample, as I've been saying, between university or student time on the one hand and school time on the other. And I think this related to the perceived degree of autonomy or flexibility an individual has in deciding how their time is spent, with university or student time typically associated with a much greater degree of discretion when compared to school time. And I think in England, Ireland, Spain and Poland, this was discussed in relation to day-to-day decisions, while, as I've been saying, in Denmark and Germany, it was typically related to decisions about the whole length of a degree and the pace at which an individual studied. So that's the first constituent. The second, I think, is that student timescapes typically encompass the specific allocation of time, what time during a degree programme is actually spent on. And here there were significant differences between the countries, as I've been showing, with respect to whether certain activities, such as paid work and volunteering, were seen as a key part of student time, or whether boundaries around student time were drawn more tightly, with paid work, for example, being viewed as limiting the time available for learning, and so an encroachment on student time. The third constituent is that timescapes were related to both the pace of study and the duration of a degree. And again, here I've shown how differences between nations were evident. Flexibility about both was considered a crucial constituent of university time by students in Denmark and Germany, but not elsewhere, and were key elements of contestation with other social actors in those two countries. So now I'm going to move on to offer some explanations for the patterns that we observed. I think, first of all, it's notable that despite the variations that I've been identifying, in all 6 nations, many of the students who participated in the focus groups understood university time as different in important ways from school time. And it was typically valued highly, largely because of the greater freedom it offered them to make decisions about how to spend their own time. And for some students, this allowed them to develop particular intellectual interest by taking different classes, additional classes in a particular subject, or reading extensively on a topic that was of particular interest to them. And for others, it enabled them to move at a different pace, one that was determined by them rather than their teachers or parents. And as I've been arguing, a key element of the Danish and students' opposition to the reforms in their nations focused on the potential loss of university time and the encroachment of school time into all parts of the education system. And in their eyes, the different components of timescapes were closely interrelated, increasing the pace of study and shortening the average duration of a degree were believed to have a direct impact on the autonomy of individual students in deciding how to spend their time. But it's interesting, I think, that a very similar distinction between school and university time was drawn by students in England and Ireland, where the total length of time for a degree has been tightly prescribed for a long time, and all students are expected to move through their studies at the same pace. And I think this pervasive distinction between school time and university time raises some important questions about the way in which educational time has been conceptualized. As I noted right at the start of the presentation, various scholars such as Barbara Adam, E.P. Thompson have argued that school time is particularly important because it tends to instill a specific form of clock time that remains with us for the rest of our lives. But I think the evidence from these European students suggests that for those who progress to higher education, which is now in many countries around half of the population, other timescapes become dominant, which may still require them to, in Adam's words, produce good work fast, but often allow greater flexibility and autonomy. So while this differentiation between school time and university time was common across the sample, as I've been saying, the three timescapes that we've identified do differ in other ways. And I want to argue that these different timescapes are quite closely linked to place, and in particular, the nation state. And I'm going to offer some explanations of this now. And I think to some extent, these different understandings can be explained by the different historical traditions that underpin higher education in the Six Nations. Germany and Denmark, in common with many other countries in Central, North and Eastern Europe, have both been strongly influenced by the Humboldtian model of the university, which emphasised the importance of Lernfreiheit, the freedom to learn and the right to prioritise one's own time. So while students across all Six Nations valued the increased autonomy in how they spent their time at university, it was only really in Germany and Denmark that this was articulated as a fundamental principle underpinning higher education. And I think influenced by this, students in those two nations have typically taken much longer to complete their studies than in other parts of Europe. In contrast, in England, Ireland and Spain, those countries have not been similarly influenced by Humboldtian principles. And as a consequence, despite the positive evaluation of university time, which I've just been talking about, the right to prioritise one's own time or decide on the length of one's degree has not been normalised in these nations. And I think these differences have implications for the overall duration and pace of studies, but also for the ways in which time is allocated during the period of being a student. With degrees of longer duration, there's clearly more time available to take up volunteering opportunities, paid work and other activities, playing into a relatively expansive definition of studenthood. And I think these kind of arguments speak to other research that's emphasised the importance of the national space in understandings of time. Shaw, for example, has contended that the pace of life differs geographically, with the average time taken to complete routine tasks differing between countries, and considerable variation in social norms about timekeeping, for example, the acceptability of being late or not. And so in her analysis, national culture plays a key role in linking place to place. I think the different national timescapes are also closely associated with activity in the policy sphere, and this has probably come through in what I've said already. The high level of contestation evident in Germany and Denmark is linked to the ways in which time has been foregrounded in recent reforms in both of those nations. So in some ways, I think students' emphasis on time in those nations can be seen as a direct response to the perceived threat to Lernfreiheit brought about by the reforms. In contrast, although Poland's higher education system has also been strongly influenced by the Humboldtian system, Poland has not brought in any recent reforms that attempt to change either the pace at which students study or the duration of a degree. And so I think this emphasis on the significance of change to the construction of timescapes does link to themes in the broader literature on acceleration, which I mentioned at the start, and which has constituted quite an important focus in the sociology of higher education, how that's been theorised recently. So given that the particular pace and duration of a degree being ushered in Denmark and Germany was broadly in line with that already in operation in the other countries in the study, the high degree of contestation in these two nations, I think, can be related to concerns on the part of most students and some staff as well about acceleration. The challenges of changing to a new tempo have been recognised in other research too. So reflecting on data from individuals who've been forced to work in different places with varying rhythms, Sean, I put this on the slide, writes, because timekeeping is profoundly embedded in everyday life, habits and values, accommodation to a different tempo challenges what is expected and can produce intense feelings of dislocation in those forced to march at an unfamiliar pace. And so I think while our Danish and German students were not necessarily accustomed to the tempo they felt ought to be an integral part of university time, it appears that their expectations of what university time should look like, based on national traditions of higher education, led them to experience the lack of freedom to study for as long as one wanted, and at the pace one wanted, as challenging. I think policy also plays into understandings of time through the specific funding mechanisms in operation in the various countries. So in nations where many students are making significant financial contributions to their studies, so England, Ireland and Spain, that if you'd had time to look at that table, you would have seen. In those kind of countries, there's undoubtedly less incentive at the individual level to want to extend the period of study than in nations such as Germany, where no tuition fees are payable, and in Denmark, where all students receive a grant to study. Moreover, in Spain, where grants have been reduced and fees increased following the 2008 global recession, and youth employment was, at the time we did our data collection, very high. Students' main concerns were ensuring they received a good standard of education and secured a decent job on graduation. So I think, taken together, such differences suggest that policy can exert a significant influence on students' understandings by affecting the extent to which temporality was seen as key to what it means to be a student, much more evident in Germany and Denmark than elsewhere, and also the nature of the student timescapes, whether short-term and bounded or longer-term and more expansive. So that takes me on to the conclusion. And I suppose, first of all, I want to argue that the data that I've been presenting today and the strong kind of national differences that emerged from our study in relation to this do, I think, raise questions that are sometimes made in the literature about European homogeneity, about the extent to which policies such as the Bologna Process have produced the kind of a homogeneous European student. And so I think that although there were some commonalities in our study, particularly this distinction between university time and school time, there were quite different timescapes emerging that I've talked about, and the importance students attributed to specific tempos of education, the duration of degrees, and the temporal boundedness. So I think it does raise some questions, I think, about whether we can make any broad statements about European students being all the same these days. I think, secondly, it does suggest that, despite arguments about globalization, Europeanization, our study does show that nation states do still exert considerable influence in how students can conceptualize time. But here I think it's quite important to note that some of these differences have been brought into sharp relief because of the introduction of policies intended to bring about more standardized models of higher education across Europe. So I think you could argue that in Denmark and Germany, this strong reaction to policy initiatives, is actually linked back to processes of Europeanisation because of the way in which the Danish and German governments have, introduced this change, partially in relation to the kind of Bologna imperative for greater comparability across Europe. And I suppose the third point I want to make is that I think that this data does suggest that time itself does play quite a crucial role in informing students' sense of what is distinctive about their university lives, even if in some national contexts, this is framed largely in terms of what they have lost or are afraid of losing. So thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to find out more, we have written a paper about timescapes, which was published in Sociology. And then we've also we've published a book from the whole project, of which the timescapes is a small part, lots of other issues discussed in that, which is available open access from Policy Press. So thank you for listening. And yeah, it'd be great to have some discussion now.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel, for a super interesting and super rich presentation, which was really spot on or right in the middle of the discussions we're having with the network. So I think this was really, really great, and I super much appreciate the empirical nature of the study you have conducted. Like when one talks about time, very often it very quickly resolves or goes into philosophical discussions or assumptions that things accelerate, or yeah, we all know space-time compression, as you mentioned in the beginning. But I think that what your analysis shows so clearly is the importance of really being, sticking to the details and seeing how things are very different in different kind of national contexts in your case. I find it super very rich to see your typification of three distinctive kinds of time that emerged and in different sorts of countries. Whilst other people are probably still collecting their thoughts, I would like to open the floor with one question, and then Rit, I will give the word to you. I will give the floor to you. What I was wondering, Rachel, in your analysis, and it's probably the very common comparative research question that you might have gotten already a couple of times, but how do you avoid, or what are your considerations in avoiding to fall into the trap of what they then call methodological nationalism, that the national becomes the explainer of what you have seen just because we stick to the concept of Poland or of Ireland or of England or whatever? Like how do you avoid, as a sociologist who worked with a massive database apparently, like how do you avoid that the national becomes the thing that explains instead of being the thing that needs explaining, if you understand what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I guess it was something that we tried to be sensitive to throughout the project. And I should say that I didn't really have much time to talk about kind of the project as a whole, but I suppose one of the starting assumptions was to, I suppose, interrogate the idea that nation states are coherent educational entities. And so I suppose that was the reason for looking at different social actors within each nation state. And I suppose other things that we've written show that, actually within countries, there is a lot of contestation about what it means to be a student. So I think, I think for some, so I suppose just to summarize in terms of the project as a whole, in relation to some aspects, for example, time, I would argue that we do see the nation state playing quite a key role, but in other aspects, not so. And so I suppose the argument would be that, it kind of depends what you're looking at. So for example, in the book, we talk about, we identify 6 kind of common constructions of students. And for example, one of them, students as workers, we argue that, that's so common across Europe. And actually, your kind of national differences don't really make any difference there at all. What is different there are kind of the stark differences between student conceptualizations across Europe on the one hand, and policymakers and some staff on the other, where actually kind of students tend to have a much broader understanding of what it means to be a higher education student in contrast to other social actors. So I think for this particular presentation, the nation state did seem to have quite an important explanatory role, but I think that's not the case in all understandings of students.
Okay, thank you very much. Grit, you were first, then we go to Esther, then to Felicitas.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. It's really nice to see you wrapping it up in that fine way. Two questions, perhaps. So one is about the future, or imaginaries of the future as a certain kind of time or temporality. I mean, I guess it's part of the job market orientedness that you described, but you're still, it seems like you've been very focused on the actual time within their, the period of study, and not so much how some sort of future or, a wider context also directs their study or sense of time during their study. So the kind of futurity or kind of imaginations of a future to come, or enacting a particular future, that kind of temporality, did that at all come into play in the material, or is it something that you've worked with in another way? So that was one, and then the other is kind of more methodologically. What is a Danish student, or what is a student in Denmark or in the UK? I guess in England you have like what you would call domestic students. They come from all over the world, or they have backgrounds, and so how do you take that into consideration? And again, maybe it's a kind of in continuation of what Matthias just asked you as well, the national context. How do you come about, exploring that, other diversities?
Thanks, Grit, and thank you for your help in the practical aspects of the project in the past. Yeah, so I suppose in terms of kind of how people talked about the future, I mean, and I think probably, again, this was an area where there was quite a lot of commonality across Europe and quite a lot of distinction between student perspectives and those of others. So I think, for example, in the book, we talk about we've got a chapter on kind of students as political actors, because this was something that came up quite strongly, and also was something that we asked students about specifically because of the discussions in the literature. And I suppose, I mean, maybe, and it's also, I guess it kind of reflects wider arguments that have been made in kind of youth studies, that there was a sense that students across Europe actually felt that they weren't valued for what they're doing in the here and now. It's being, presented as somebody in the making. And so actually this wasn't so much the case in Denmark, for various reasons, but in some countries there was a sense that students felt they weren't taken seriously as political actors, for example, that their political activity wasn't recognized in the here and now. It was more about kind of preparing for future activity in that sphere or future work. And so I think there was a frustration that others positioned students as people in the making, whereas they saw themselves as individuals in the here and now who should be recognized for that. So I think that, again, we didn't ask them about that specifically, but I think that kind of frustration did come through across the different national contexts. And I think, a big frustration with the way in which they felt they were seen by policymakers as only future workers, not even workers in the here and now, which many of them were doing, but just future workers. And there was that was brought up, explicitly in, I think, all of the countries, that frustration. And then in relation to kind of, what a Danish student is, I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that. Is your point about how important is the national context as opposed to all the other variables that might make up a student?
I think I'm just curious about how do you deal with diversity? How do you, in your analysis, get at, people come with different backgrounds, and maybe some of the aspects that you've now highlighted has a specific, there's a distribution which is kind of central across different kinds of students. So what is how long do you have to be in the UK or elsewhere to be considered as a Danish student or a UK student. Or, I mean, it's not Erasmus students, of course, that you've been talking to, but still you can come to the UK and take a full degree and then leave again afterwards.
Yeah, no, so we, in all 6 countries, we excluded international students from the sample because I just felt that would just raise a whole load of other issues, which, you know, there would be lots of overlaps, but also lots of other issues. So I think in general, you know, our criteria to be involved in the study was you had to be a national of that country in which you were studying. But I think, you know, there are, you know, your question does raise broader issues about kind of, you know, even within nation states kind of, you know, variability. So I think, you know, one thing with our methodology that we were less good at doing was looking at kind of the impact of individual social characteristics such as gender, class, ethnicity on understandings. But I think in some countries, because of the way in which we chose the universities, they could actually act as a proxy for those, particularly in countries with kind of quite hierarchical systems. So, for example, in England, the students who attended the kind of younger, lower status institution, you know, typically came from, you know, families without a history of university, and their perspectives were actually quite different from the students at the kind of more elite university that typically did have family experience. In, for example, the emphasis they put on employability, that actually, you know, kind of for them, they'd given up a lot to be at university financially, socially, and the kind of employment gain was really important in the way in which at the elite English university, people just assumed they would get a good job. They had, you know, they'd always assumed they'd go to university. And so I think, you know, even within countries, there were those kind of differences by social background playing out. And I think we can see that to some extent in the other countries too. So I think, you know, this is complex. There are kind of, you know, lots of these kinds of different variables. But I suppose overall in the project, we found that there were some interesting differences by nation state, as well as some interesting commonalities across Europe too. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Grit, but...
Okay, thank you. Esther, you're up next.
Yeah, I think I was wondering about social imaginaries of the past. So how students reflected on perhaps their parents' experience of being a student, or, you know, the past imaginaries of what the university is and how to be in universities and how it changed over time, whether they had a perspective on that or they were in the here and now.
I think that does actually link back to this presentation. I would say it was mainly in relation to things that people valued about the higher education system that they think had either been lost recently or in the process of being lost, which was primarily in Germany and Denmark in relation to this kind of change in the tempo and the pace. And so I think that was talked about as a loss in ways in which we didn't really see replicated in any of the other countries. I would say that in terms of looking back to the past, that did come through quite strongly, though, amongst higher education staff and to some extent policymakers. So typically higher education staff in many of the countries talked about the kind of negative impact of market reform on what it means to be a student, and how kind of, you know, in their generation it was much better. And sometimes this was almost kind of, you know, it almost kind of positioned the students as problematic. So, you know, students aren't as politically active now as in the past. Students don't work as hard now as in the past. And although on the surface that looked like a kind of a criticism of students, I think underpinning it was meant to be a kind of a critique of higher education change. And so I think, you know, there's been quite a lot written about kind of, you know, that kind of nostalgic view that, you know, actually in the 60s, only a relatively small proportion of students were actually involved in political kind of activity. And yet, you know, by many of our staff respondents talked about it as if in the 60s, you know, everybody was on the street. So there was that kind of rose-tinted glasses at the past. But I think it was mainly staff who were, I suppose, either reflecting on change in students over their career, or they were contrasting student experience now with their own in the past. I think it was actually quite rare for students to have any kind of historical view, apart from in Germany and Denmark in relation to time.
Thank you. Felicitas, you are next in line.
Yeah, thank you from me as well for the talk. I think you've already answered my first question in your response to Esther just now, but I'm going to formulate it anyway because maybe there's a different aspect in there. I think I've got two things I'm wondering about. The one thing is, I thought it was very striking, the notion of change in Germany and Denmark. I'm based in Germany just now, although it might not sound like it, but I'm based in Germany just now and can observe here. It was about 2009 or something where the Bologna reform was turned into master's and bachelor reform. So these students would have been like 9 at the time or something. And yet they seem to have a really strong sense of a change, although it was already quite a normal system for them, normalized system for them. But it's such a strong discourse in Germany, and you've mentioned this a little bit in your last question, yeah? Last response. It's such a strong discourse that students have lost something. Like all my colleagues feel there's a loss from before. So there's this, you talked about the nation state as a policy making, but to what extent is it relevant for you as a sort of discursive assemblage of norms and expectations and things? And schoolification is one of the words that's used in Germany a lot. That just talks specifically to what you observed. I really appreciated your analysis there. The second thing is maybe what happened after COVID or after Corona. There was an article in The Guardian last week, I think, about which seemed to just speak to the issues you're talking about and how students in Britain now are no longer turning up because cost of living crisis, because more work, and there's a different sense of temporality in there. And I wondered if, although your research was before, if you have any observations on the more recent changes and if things are changing in that sense on a bigger level and a broader level in these societies.
Yeah, thank you. Two interesting questions. Yes, I think you're right, because I suppose when we were doing the data collection, I kind of was aware of the policy context in Germany and Denmark, but I thought, it had kind of happened, and so I think you're right that it is this kind of discourse that the individuals themselves haven't necessarily experienced the change. Although I think, some did talk about, particularly when we talked about to the staff, that, there were actually policies kind of linked to this that were just taking it a little bit further at the time of our data collection. So I think, there was a sense that there was actually some kind of associated change happening now. But I think you're right that, these individuals hadn't experienced that change over the course of their degree. So the kind of, they were looking back and perhaps talking about change that others had experienced. And I think yes, and again I think that just sort of supports probably the argument that I was making, that there do seem to be these national norms that weren't people didn't kind of talk about that in other countries. Although I think you could make the comparison with England that when fees went up a lot, when fees were introduced at all, there was a lot of kind of student pushback. And it's quite interesting that in England, I think that isn't a national discourse anymore. People just have accepted that. And so I think that maybe there are also interesting differences about how long people hang on to these kind of regret, sense of loss, etc., which is quite interesting. And then your second point about kind of attendance, etc., as a result of COVID. I mean, yeah, in England, that is something that universities are thinking a lot about. I mean, I guess to some extent it's about time, but I think maybe it's also about kind of space and place. Where is the space of the university? If people are just seeing it as a kind of in their bedrooms through the online learning, and I think there are some really interesting questions there, and about the extent to which it's important, to come together at the same time, but also in the same place, and is that a key part of learning or not? And I think certainly in the UK, I think staff, I don't know, universities seem to have different views. I think a lot of teaching staff do think it's really important, and therefore we shouldn't be providing a lot of material online to make it, essential that students come onto campus. But I think equally other people, have a more individualized approach. They think, maybe that's fine if that's how students want to learn. But also I think it's, it's linked in with a wider political context that actually, the English system is a very market-driven one. Universities tend to do what students want in the short term. So I think there are those things playing into it. But I think if we see this sort of persisting, over the next few years, I think it does raise questions about, what it means to be a student. Is physical proximity to others important or not? And then the times at which you study, because I guess if you're just looking at recorded lectures, then you can, look at them whatever time suits you. So I think potentially if this is a trend that stays, it may well affect both the temporality of learning and the spatiality too.
No, super interesting. And there's in Leuven in Belgium a lot of debates after COVID as to whether or not it is a required right of students to have recorded lessons or lectures or not. And so there equally seems to be a need, like not only a temporality that has changed, but equally the spatiality of the university seems to somehow be in transformation. Ian, are you there? Because I see a raised hand, but I don't see your camera. Oh, okay, fantastic.
Yeah, I'm there, sorry, but without the camera. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. Actually, this last point that was talked about in terms of spatiality is a question that I had, because during the talk, when you were talking about the importance of place in sort of defining the temporal aspects of studying, I don't know why in my head I was thinking, oh, you're about to talk about campus versus non-campus type universities, but then instead you talked about the nation state, and I really appreciated your analysis of that. But I'm wondering, and I don't know much about all of these different national contexts, but I think certainly like in the UK, the difference between London universities that often aren't very campus-based, or these smaller town universities where, a lot of students are living in close proximity to one another. I'm also familiar with the Indian situation where you have these campus universities where both the faculty and students are living together on campus. And I'm wondering how much this changes the temporality of the feeling of being a student, because when you only interact, or when you primarily interact with people who are also students or also teachers, it must change the overall feeling. Whereas if you are working, or if you're even living amongst people, real people with real jobs, then it must very much change also your feeling of this sort of empty time. Maybe empty time is not the right term, but it's sort of, this wonderful feeling that many of us had, I think, when we were undergraduates, that, that we could be masters of our own time to a certain degree. And then maybe this explains the nostalgia many people have about being students back when they were students, this sort of wonderful emptiness where like, oh, I can decide what I do today. I'm going to read this or et cetera and so on. And that, so I'm wondering how much it comes out in your study, the campus versus non-campus type arrangements. So that was one question. The second one, it also came up, and it is a little bit about class or about who gets to be unproductive with their time. I work in a situation, basically I work with displaced learners in a higher education setting, and very often they come in to universities on scholarships or some sort of project, and this means that they're expected very much to study very hard and do well and succeed. And if they don't, then there's a lot of pressure there. Whereas if you're a student from a background in which you're a more privileged background, there's certainly more affordance given to you in terms of how you, I use the word waste, not deliberately sort of waste your time, in the sense that like you're allowed that sort of freedom whilst being a student to, try things, fail maybe, try other things and so on. So and I know you mentioned the difference between the so-called newer or older universities in the English context, but I wondered whether this, I know also you mentioned that class wasn't a focus of your analysis, but I was also wondering how much this played out in terms of the temporality, where people came from a social background where they were allowed to be a bit more free in their time, because there was sort of an understanding and an enculturation that it's okay to, not only just be constantly focused. And I can imagine this very much in the post-socialist context where I live now, and I see older generations who really struggle with unproductive use of time, even when there's been like an intergenerational transfer from one in terms of like, people sending their children to university where they didn't go to university themselves. They can't fully imagine this sort of the wonderful emptiness of undergraduate time as well. So apologies, I went on a bit longer than I am. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ian. Two really interesting questions there. Yeah, so I think in relation to your first question about sort of the space of the campus or not the campus, I should say we had the vast majority of the students in our sample were full-time undergraduates. And I think if we'd included part-time students, who are basically workers and just, studying 1 day a week, that would have been different. But I suppose in relation to the kind of question, probably the main difference we saw was with respect to accommodation, like where students were living. And obviously across Europe, there are quite big differences in the norms around that. So we see a kind of really strong emphasis on the residential experience in England and Ireland, and less so in the other countries. And I think, so we had students in our sample who were living in student accommodation, who were living, with friends and with parents. And I think we wrote a paper about kind of, that relationship with parents and how that can actually really affect what it means to be a student, both in terms of kind of, where you are actually physically and all the, things that brings with it, but also, I suppose, financial dependence on parents, because the different countries have different mechanisms for supporting students. And I think, in some countries, students are just much more, they have to be much more financially dependent on their parents than some other countries. And so I think those are norms about who you live with, and those norms about who's financially supporting you do actually have a really profound effect on what it means to be a student. And maybe it also links into the time a little bit in to what extent you feel autonomous, because I think in some of the countries, particularly Spain, there was a sense of, actually, I'm quite indebted to my parents because, that there wasn't any independent financial, or very little independent financial support. So I think those kind of relationships, which aren't just financial, but are also about kind of where you're living, can have quite a profound effect. In terms of, I guess we've got less to say about the actual campus. There was quite a bit of variation in our sample. Like maybe we discuss it most in relation to sort of political activity, that some campuses, were just much more spatially much more political, because they just had kind of, a lot of posters up, a lot of kind of spaces in which students could express their political views, and others didn't. But I think probably that's something that we could have interrogated a bit further. I would say it's mainly the accommodation, I think, that seemed to have the biggest influence, the spaces there. And in relation to your second question about who gets to be unproductive with their time, and I think that is a really interesting question, and I think that did kind of come up a little bit in terms of just involvement in kind of extracurricular activities, with some students saying, well, I just don't have time to do that because I'm either studying or I'm doing paid work, and that's kind of how it is. And I think, although we didn't really talk about class in the focus groups, that did come up in terms of the different financial resources people had there. So I guess that's another way in which what I was talking about today is just sort of very general kind of pictures that actually within those nation states there are still kind of there is still variation, and there is still difference, because I think yes, certainly in relation to kind of volunteering and that kind of activity, clearly that not all students have the time to do that for a variety of reasons. So I think I would completely agree with your analysis that how time is actually played out at the individual level is affected by class and financial resources to quite a significant degree.
Thanks, Ian. Great questions. We have 2 minutes left, Sarah. So you get the last question, particularly the kind request to not make it too long, so that we can end more or less in time, if that is okay for you.
Sure, thank you. Ian sort of preempted where I was going with this, so I'll keep it short. And I come from a Southern African perspective, and it's interesting to see how time and space relationship to education, basic and higher, there are similarities. I know you talked about national differences, but there are so many converging similarities. And one of the things we found with students in the South African context was, and do students understand in your cohort that ironically that lack of quote unquote unproductive time to volunteer, do sports, participate in cultural activities, ironically gives them a form of future cultural capital towards that labor market? So there's students who didn't have it, it's class again, students who were unable to participate in that freedom knew that their inability to signal on a CV or in an interview, I was the leader of this group, or I did this sport, or I volunteered on this NGO in Uganda, that their lack of temporality in the present somehow meant that they couldn't spin signals to the future labour market of their class status through being able to work for free, internships, volunteering, that sort of thing. So students in the Southern African context were deeply aware that they need to go and work to pay the rent today, meant they couldn't do things that would look good on their CV tomorrow. But the higher class students just saw this as kind of being a good citizen and weren't as aware of how their contemporary temporality signaled to the future labour market that they were high class. I don't know if that makes much sense. Were your students aware of that temporal antagonism?
I think not all, actually. I mean, that's something that did come across in some of the focus groups where, you know, there were lots of first in family students, where there was kind of an assumption, I think, amongst some that kind of, you know, the degree would be enough, and that, you know, some lack of awareness, I suppose, that actually, you know, that often employers are looking for something beyond a degree because so many people have a degree now. So I think that, and there's been other, so I would say that was probably, yeah, because of the kind of very stratified nature of the English higher education system. In the English sample, it's easier to identify the kind of students without a family of higher education because they were all congregated in this one university. And I would say that their attitudes were quite different from the others, in often thinking that, you know, it was just a degree, that, you know, just a degree would be sufficient. And other research that I've conducted as well has kind of reinforce that view that sometimes there isn't always a great awareness, that often you need more than a degree. But I think that's not the case for all students. And I think, you know, that there certainly were some that, you know, and also staff spoke about this too, about the kind of, you know, frustrations of wanting to do more. Not I suppose not just in an instrumental sense, but just wanting to have, you know, a kind of, you know, fun and contribute to society, but actually that the frustration of, you know, not being able to do that because of the need to engage in paid work alongside studies, and how that just didn't leave time for anything else. So I think it was a bit of a mixed picture, but I think that as well as people who were aware of that, there were others who probably weren't in the sample. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Sarah. So yeah.
It wasn't a well-framed question, but I think you got the gist of what I was trying to say. Yeah, thank you. We'll discuss more at another time.
Indeed, unfortunately at another time, because we are already 2 minutes past time, but I think the richness of the discussion shows the richness of the presentation, because the discussion is always only as rich as the presentation is. So thank you again super much, Rachel, for being with us here. Thanks to all of you for the very nice questions. Jitka, do I hand over to you again? Do you have a final thing to say on behalf of the network?
Maybe just thank you, all of you, to being here. And now I will stop recording.
And hopefully see you at ESER or any later ESERs in person. Nice to see you.